Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored today to have with us Vice President Dick Cheney, who has often been referred to as the most powerful Vice President of the United States in recent history. Mr. Vice President, you can look back at a career that includes high-level public service as a congressman, as a White House Chief of Staff under President Ford at a very young age, and Secretary of Defense from 1989 to 1993. But you look also back at a career as the CEO of one of the Fortune 500 companies. Now, as the Vice President of the United States of America, you play a crucial and critical leadership role in the war against terrorism. Last year, Mr. Vice President, on the brink of the Iraq war, the atmosphere here in Davos was very dense and very emotional. Today, I think we have some signs of hope. The atmosphere here is much more upbeat, and the time has come for the international community to bond together and to deal together in addressing the new challenges of the 21st century. We are delighted and honored, Mr. Vice President, to have you here in Davos on one of your very rare overseas visits. As the head of the Senate, you have to stay usually in Washington, and we are very eager to hear your assessment of the state of the world and how the state of the world could be improved. I would also welcome very cordially Mrs. Cheney, Mrs. Lion Cheney among us, who is who, as you know, is an author and has chaired important institutions, particularly related to charity. Mr. Vice President, we look forward to your important message, and we want to hear from you how you see the world evolving.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Schwab, and I'm honored to join all of you this morning and to be in such distinguished company. I am grateful to the World Economic Forum and to the Swiss government for hosting this important event over the years. I see some old friends here and many good friends of the United States. To all of you, I bring the best wishes and the best wishes of the American people and President George W. Bush this morning. As we came into the valley yesterday, the setting reminded me of the Mountain West, the part of America that I call home. This is the best kind of place to come when you want to draw back from the daily rush of events and focus on matters of large and long-term consequence. And calm deliberation is the spirit of this conference, to see beyond the political pressures of the moment and to take the long view. Recent events give us many reasons for optimism. The capture of Saddam Hussein, the adoption of a new democratic constitution in Afghanistan, Libya's decision to abandon its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, the recent warming between India and Pakistan, and the return to robust economic growth in the United States and Asia. These all point to a future that is more hopeful than many people believed possible just a year ago. And think what has happened in Europe in recent years. Progress and cooperation that could not have been imagined just a few generations ago. In the living memory of some in this room, Europe was a source of constant violence and threats that reached beyond the continent. Today, in every direction from this city, Europe is united and peaceful, and this continent now stands as an example to all nations of economic success and democratic stability. The success of modern Europe is one of the great stories of human experience. It is also the story of a great and enduring alliance among free peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. Through 6 decades and 12 American presidents, the United States and Europe have faced monumental challenges and have overcome them together. Because transatlantic ties held strong against the forces of fascism and imperial communism, our nations have been able to thrive in the pursuit of peace. The subjects we talk about at gatherings like this, economic growth, the expansion of trade, new opportunities for our people, all reflect the confidence of free societies. And the confidence rests on the basic architecture of security that we've created together. Today's generation of leaders has no greater responsibility than to protect our people against new dangers. On September 11th, 2001, we saw the face of danger in our era with terrible clarity. On that morning, in the space of 3 hours, 19 men carrying only box cutters and airplane tickets inflicted suffering and death on some 3,000 innocent men, women, and children. This was a tragic loss for my nation. But among the casualties that day were also citizens of more than 50 other countries. And yet, for all the destruction and grief that it caused, September 11th gave us the merest glimpse of the threat that international terrorism poses to us all. There have always been small groups willing to use random murder to shock and intimidate. Yet in crucial respects, the 21st century terrorism presents a new and far greater peril. Today, we face a sophisticated global network of terrorists who are opposed to the values of liberty, tolerance, and openness that form the basis of our societies. Their hatred and sense of grievance are not directed at any one government or nation or religion, but against all governments, nations, and people that stand in their way. And so we have seen further atrocities committed since 9/11 in Bali, Jakarta, Najaf, Jerusalem, Casablanca, Riyadh, Mombasa, Istanbul, Baghdad, and elsewhere. Today's terrorists send young men and women on missions of suicide and murder and call it martyrdom. They would as readily kill 300,000 innocents as they killed 3,000, and they are seeking the means to do exactly that. From material seized by coalition forces in Afghanistan and from interrogations of captured terrorists, we know they are doing everything they can to develop or acquire chemical, biological, radiological, and even nuclear weapons. Were they to gain those weapons, either by their own efforts or with the help of an outlaw regime, no appeal to reason or morality would prevent them from committing the worst of terrors. In the words of the recently published EU security strategy, the terrorists are willing to use unlimited violence to cause massive casualties. We must act with all urgency that this danger demands. Civilized people must do everything in our power to defeat terrorism and to stop the spread of weapons of mass destruction. These tasks that we face are tasks that we'll face far into the future. And our success will depend on meeting 3 fundamental responsibilities. First, we must confront the ideologies of violence at the source by promoting democracy throughout the greater Middle East and beyond. Second, we must meet these dangers together. Cooperation among our governments and effective international institutions are even more important today than they have been in the past. And third, when diplomacy fails, we must be prepared to face our responsibilities and be willing to use force if necessary. Direct threats require decisive action. Let me begin with the first of these, the defeat of violence through the advance of freedom. The theme of this conference states that there can be no prosperity without security, and security cannot be achieved in the absence of prosperity. But while we know that security and prosperity are mutually dependent, we must go a step further and ask how they are best achieved. And the answer lies in the values of freedom, justice, and democracy. We know from experience that the institutions of self-government turn the energies of human beings away from violence to the peaceful work of building better lives. Democracies do not breed the anger and the radicalism that drag down whole societies and export violence. Terrorists do not find fertile recruiting grounds in societies where young people have the right to guide their own destinies and to choose their own leaders. For the best illustration of these truths, we need not look far. In the middle of the 20th century, generations of conflict had led some to conclude that permanent tension was a fact of life in Europe, and that some European cultures were incapable of sustaining democratic values. We now know that this pessimistic view was false. The true sources of conflict were despotic and anti-democratic regimes. The defeat of fascism and the spread of democracy after World War II was the precondition for peace and prosperity in Western Europe. Only when both had become stable democracies could Germany and France be at peace. And that reconciliation, as much as any other event, helped bring about the European community we know today. Likewise, the defeat of Soviet communism and the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe made possible a continent whole and free and increasingly stable and prosperous. What was once said about Europe has been said at various times about Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and is often said today about the greater Middle East. We are told that the culture and the beliefs of Islamic peoples are somehow incompatible with the values and the aspirations of freedom and democracy. These claims are condescending and they are false. Many of the world's Muslims today live in democratic societies. Turkey is perhaps the premier example. That is why it has recently been the target of terrorist violence. Turkey deserves our support, including for its European aspirations. Millions of other Muslims live and flourish as democratic citizens in Europe, Asia, and the United States. The desire for freedom is not just American or Western, it is universal. Whenever ordinary people are given the chance to choose, they choose freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, not slavery, tyranny, and the heavy tread of the secret police. In the years of the Cold War, we learned that we could not safely put a border on freedom. Security was not divisible in Europe. It is not divisible in the world. Our choice is not between a unipolar world and a multipolar world. Our choice is for a just, free, and a democratic world. That requires the insights, the sacrifices, and the resources of all democratic nations. And it requires the courage, the sacrifice, and the dedication of those now denied their basic freedoms. It's clear that reform has many advocates in the Muslim world. Arab intellectuals have spoken of a freedom deficit and of the imperative of internal reform, greater political participation, the rule of law, economic openness, and wider trade. As some at this conference can attest, we've seen movement toward reform in the greater Middle East. In Morocco, King Mohammed recently called for greater protection of women's rights. In Jordan, elections have been held, and the government is taking steps to reduce state control of the press. In Bahrain, elections were held last year and women were able to run for office for the first time. In Egypt, the ruling National Democratic Parties called for increased economic reform and expanded political participation. In Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Abdullah has issued an Arab charter for reform and called for the holding of municipal elections. These changes demonstrate what we all know, that true reform and democracy must come from brave and forward-looking people in each country. And those of us who are privileged to live in freedom have a responsibility to support these historic steps. The rulers of Iran must follow the example being set by others throughout the greater Middle East. In that great nation, there is a growing call for true democracy and human rights. Europe and America must stand as one in calling for the regime to honor the legitimate demands of the Iranian people. They ask nothing more than to enjoy their God-given right to live their lives as free men and women. Of course, the most dramatic recent examples of democratic progress are to be seen in the liberated countries of Afghanistan and Iraq. In Afghanistan, 2 years after the overthrow of the brutal Taliban regime, the Loya Jirga has approved a constitution that reflects the values of tolerance and of equal rights for women. Under President Karzai's leadership and with the help of democratic countries around the world, the Afghan people are building a decent, just, and a free society, and a nation that will never again be a safe haven for terror. In Iraq, too, after decades of Ba'athist rule, democracy is beginning to take hold. Less than a year ago, the people of that country lived under the absolute power of one man and his apparatus of intimidation and torture. Today, the former dictator sits in captivity, while the people of Iraq prepare for full self-government. Saddam Hussein can no longer harbor and support terrorists, and his long efforts to acquire weapons of mass destruction are finally at an end. A new Iraqi police force now protects the people instead of bullying them. Hundreds of Iraqi newspapers are now in circulation, with no Ba'athist enforcers telling them what to print. A coalition of nations led by the United States is working with Iraq's new governing council to prepare the way for a transition to full Iraqi sovereignty by the end of June. Iraqis are preparing a fundamental law which will guarantee certain basic rights. Month by month, Iraqis are assuming more responsibility for their own security and their own future. The United States and our coalition partners will stand with them and continue to sacrifice to ensure their safety until that work is done. We urge all democratic nations and the United Nations to answer the Iraqi Governing Council's call for support for the people of Iraq in making the transition to democracy. We urge all nations holding Iraqi debt to be generous in forgiving it. Our forward strategy for freedom commits us to support those who work and sacrifice for reform across the greater Middle East. We call upon our democratic friends and allies everywhere, and in Europe in particular, to join us in this effort. Europeans know that their great experiment in building peace, unity, and prosperity cannot survive as a privileged enclave surrounded on its outskirts by breeding grounds of hatred and fanaticism. The days of looking the other way while despotic regimes trample human rights, rob their nation's wealth, and then excuse their failings by feeding their people a steady diet of anti-Western hatred are over. Nations fail their people if they compromise their values in the hope of achieving stability. Instead, we must seek a higher standard, one that will apply to our friends in the region no less than to our adversaries. Just as democratic reform is the key to the future that the people of the Middle East deserve, so it is also essential to a peaceful resolution of the long-standing Arab-Israeli dispute. We seek recognition and security for Israel, and we support a viable, independent Palestinian state. But peace will not be achieved by Palestinian rulers who intimidate opposition, tolerate and profit from corruption, and maintain ties to terrorist groups. The best hope for lasting peace depends on true democracy. And a true Palestinian democracy requires leaders who understand that terror has in fact been the worst enemy of the Palestinian people and are prepared to remove it from their midst. Israel, too, must redouble its efforts by alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people and by avoiding actions that undermine the long-term viability of a two-state solution. Encouraging the spread of freedom and democracy is the right thing to do, and it is also very much in our collective self-interest. Helping the people of the greater Middle East to overcome the freedom deficit is ultimately the key to winning the broader war on terror. It is one of the great tasks of our time, and it will require resolve and resources for a generation or more. This is work for many hands, and here we see our second great responsibility: to keep our alliances and international partnerships strong and to cooperate on every front as we meet common dangers. We've made much progress in the past 2 years. Not long ago, terrorists lived with impunity in cities across Europe and obtained official American visas, exploiting the openness of our societies and using it against us. Today, our intelligence and law enforcement services are cooperating to tighten the noose around terrorists, to choke off their sources of funding, to prevent them from moving freely across our borders, and to apprehend them before they can strike again. We have created new tools to strengthen our efforts, like the recently signed U.S.-EU extradition and mutual legal assistance treaties. And each of us bears a responsibility to ensure that these treaties are fully enforced. By these means, we are safer, but we are not yet safe. Each of us bears responsibility to close the holes in our common effort against terror and weapons of mass destruction. Our military actions have also been carried out with the help of many allies and partners on this continent and around the world. It is no surprise to President Bush and me that 21 of the 34 countries keeping peace with us in Iraq today are NATO allies and partners. Along with Great Britain, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the Netherlands have all made substantial contributions, with Poland taking command of a multinational division and Spain making a major troop commitment. 38 countries have forces in Afghanistan, 28 from the European continent, as well as others from the Middle East, East Asia, and North America. In Afghanistan, Germany's taken a leading role in providing forces and in expanding the role of NATO. NATO itself is undergoing the most dramatic and important transformation in its history. It's expanding its membership, creating a rapid response force, leading the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul, while widening its role in Afghanistan, and supporting the Polish-led division in Iraq. These deployments, hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles from the European heartland, speak to our common understanding that today's threats must be met where they are, or those threats will come to us. But we have much more work to do. As Lord Robertson, NATO's former Secretary General, has said, NATO's credibility is in its capability. Today, Europe and Canada have 1.4 million soldiers under arms, but only 55,000 deployed, and many European militaries still maintain that they're overstretched. We've spoken often before, since before I was Secretary of Defense, about the need for more deployable European forces, and today that need's critical, and Secretary General de Hoop-Scheffer has made this a priority. Another priority is greater cooperation and burden sharing between NATO and the EU. None of us can afford waste, duplication, or competition between the two great institutions in Brussels. America wants the strongest possible Europe. And just as we must not force you to choose between your European and transatlantic vocations, you must not sell yourself short and settle for less than the military capability and influence that your people deserve. We also urge our allies and partners in Asia and Latin America to strengthen their defense capabilities and to join in our shared efforts to preserve the peace. Among others, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic have taken the courageous step of joining peace efforts in Iraq. They have our respect and gratitude. The grave problem of proliferation must also be addressed with united action. Different situations will require different strategies. Along with China, Japan, South Korea, and Russia, America is determined to see that North Korea eliminates its nuclear program. We are supporting the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency to hold the government of Iran to its commitment not to develop nuclear weapons. We must remain united in demanding that Iran meet its international commitments. As we pursue this work, We must look hard at existing multilateral institutions and treaties to ensure they are up to the challenges of the 21st century. Existing mechanisms may have slowed the spread of deadly weapons, but they clearly have not prevented it. Last year, the U.S. and 10 other nations, including Australia, France, Italy, Japan, and Spain, formed the Proliferation Security Initiative, a joint effort to identify and interdict the most dangerous weapons and missiles in transit. For too many years, those materials have crossed oceans and continents without a serious or systematic effort to stop them. Today, knowing that terrorists are actively seeking the weapons to match their ambitions, the risks of inaction are impossible to overstate. So we must proceed in dead earnest with a broad, effective global effort to halt the transfer of those weapons before it's too late. Each nation should also look within at laws and business practices that may have been insufficient to prevent the export of items that enable the production of weapons of mass destruction. In all of our actions, the world's democracies must send an unmistakable message that the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction only invites isolation and carries great cost. And leaders who abandon the pursuit of those weapons will find an open path to far better relations with governments around the world. That message has already yielded a response in Tripoli. In December, after 9 months of intensive diplomacy, Colonel Gaddafi voluntarily pledged to disclose and dismantle all of his regime's weapons of mass destruction programs. A successful German-Italian effort to interdict a shipment of centrifuge parts bound for Libya surely helped crystallize his decision. Today, with the cooperation of Libya's government, American and British experts and IAEA inspectors have already examined a sizable weapons program, including a uranium enrichment project for nuclear weapons. In the months to come, Libya has agreed to provide a full inventory, and inspectors will assist Libya in dismantling its entire WMD programs and its longer-range missiles. Libya has now ratified the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and early next month will become the 159th country to join the Chemical Weapons Convention. Our understanding with Libya came about through quiet diplomacy. It is the result, however, of policies and principles declared to all. Over the last 2 years, we have demonstrated that when we speak of fighting terrorism and of ending the spread of weapons of mass destruction, we mean exactly what we say. Our diplomacy with Libya was successful only because our word was credible. That kind of credibility can be earned in only one way: by keeping commitments, even when they bring difficulty and sacrifice, by leaving potential adversaries with no doubt that dangerous conduct will invite certain consequences. And so the third responsibility of free nations is to be ready, as a last resort, to apply military force. Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in successful, strong democracies are accustomed to the forms of good faith negotiation and the peaceful resolution of differences. We observe those forms every day in our legislatures, parliaments, and legal systems. Following World War II, the victorious democracies and their newly liberated partners shared those standards of debate and conduct with the world through the United Nations and other international organizations we work together to create. There is a temptation, however, to assume that the good faith that underlies these institutions will always be returned. Yet, as we saw in the case of Iraq, after 12 years and more than a dozen Security Council resolutions, the last one vowing serious consequences, there comes a time when deceit and defiance must be seen for what they are. At that point, a gathering danger must be directly confronted. At that point, we must show that behind our resolutions is actual resolve. As President Bush has said, our people have given us the duty to defend them, and that duty sometimes requires the violent restraint of violent men. Inaction can bring its own serious consequences. Had we not acted, Saddam Hussein would still be in power, and there is little question he would still be defying the United Nations and making a mockery of its mission. Because we acted, 25 million people live free of Saddam's tyranny today. Never again will they have to fear the arbitrary rule of the dictator and his sons, the torture chambers, the mass graves, and the whole apparatus of terror that sustained their power. The people of Iraq have been delivered from a nightmare, and every person now engaged in the work of making Iraq a stable and a democratic nation has contributed to a just cause and to the peace of the world. None of the responsibilities I've described this morning are easily met. Promoting freedom, justice, and democracy in areas that have known generations of despotism is an enormous undertaking. Working cooperatively against the dangers of a new era will place demands on all of us, and there will be occasional differences, even among allies who have great respect for one another. And using military power when no alternative remains will always be the most difficult decision that leaders can make. We do not shrink from these obligations because we know from bitter experience that tragedy can come from division, weakness, and vacillation. We are determined that today's challenges do not become tomorrow's crises. This will test our diplomacy and our resolve. Going forward, we can be guided as well by one of the last century's most hopeful lessons. History has not dealt kindly with dictators and murderous ideologies. The momentum of history is on the side of human freedom. And when free people are clear in our purposes and confident in our ideals and united in our defense, no enemy will prevail against us. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, this was a comprehensive presentation of the United States policies, but it was much more. I think it was a presentation of our joint responsibilities in the world. As it is tradition in Davos, the Vice President has agreed to answer some questions. Who would like, I see so many hands going up, we will be able only to take some.
Mr. Vice President, John Finnegan from Oman, together with Minister Maqbul Sultan. So, thank you for those warm words, which were very much appreciated about the Islamic and the Arab world. May we ask, Mr. Vice President, would you be so kind as to ensure that they are continued to Secretary Ashcroft and to those who work for him, so that visitors from our region are treated with greater discretion and sensitivity when they visit your wonderful country. Thank you, sir.
Would you like to respond?
I will certainly be happy to pass on messages to my colleague, John Ashcroft. There's no question but what we have tried to improve and tighten up our entry and exit procedures in the United States. We are aware that there are still glitches in the system, that it is sometimes an onerous process, and we're doing our best to improve upon it. And we just need to continue to work at it.
Next question over here.
My name is Mustafa Tseric. I am the Grand Mufti of Bosnia. This is a chance for me to speak on behalf of the Bosnian people and to pass their gratitude for what you have done in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please, Mr. Vice President, if you can convey to the American people that we will never forget that you came to Bosnia to help us survive as Muslims in the Balkan Peninsula. We will never forget that. We didn't have oil. You didn't have any interest to gain. You came to Bosnia and Herzegovina just to show your credibility and your sense of morality. Besides this, I would like to say that I like from your speech that this year we have heard more about freedom than about security. I hope that in the future that Americans will talk more about freedom around the world than about the security. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fred Bergston from the Institute for International Economics. Mr. Vice President, you did not have a chance to address economic issues in your address, but that is, of course, a central topic here at Davos, and I'd like to ask you one question in that area. I think it's fair to say there's been enormous admiration expressed here this week about the strength of the U.S. economy, particularly the recovery that is now clearly underway. But there has been one nagging question about the sustainability of that recovery, and that relates to the outlook for the U.S. budget position. In fact, there have been several questions about a comment made by your former colleague, Paul O'Neill, in his new book. When he quotes that famous meeting that he and Chairman Greenspan had with you, when he recounts you as saying, President Reagan showed that budget deficits don't matter. Could you comment as to whether that is the philosophy and how you intend to overcome that concern?
Well, I guess the way you could look at that whole exercise is that I'm not the best personnel officer in the world. The President took my advice on Secretary of the Treasury. Of course, prior to that, he put me in charge of the search for the Vice President, and that came out in unexpected ways as well. I believe deficits do matter, but I also am a great believer in the policy we followed, and that is to say that it was very important for us to reduce the tax burden on the American economy by way of stimulating growth, and that the progress we see today with respect to our economy is directly related to that. Paul did not support the tax cuts that I favored and that the President obviously ultimately decided upon, and that really goes to the heart of the debate. I do think deficits matter. They matter in the long term. You do have to worry about them. Our plan that the President laid out the other night at the State of the Union speech is to reduce the deficit in half over the next 5 years, and I think we'll get there. If you look at our deficit today, while it's large, it's not that large from a historic standpoint as a percentage of GDP. We think it is manageable, especially given the state we're in, where we're engaged in a military conflict. We've had to significantly increase defense spending. We inherited a recession which caused a fall off in government revenues. So for a lot of reasons, I don't find it surprising, one, that we have a deficit, but in terms of trying to move back to a balanced budget, that clearly would be our long-term goal and objective. But we would not now move immediately, for example, to a balanced budget at the cost of adequately funding our military operations or having the kind of pro-growth policies that we think are vital to generating long-term revenues for the economy. So we think we've got it calibrated about right, and I wouldn't believe everything I read in Paul O'Neill's book. Carol?
Yes, Mr. Vice. Hello? Yeah, Mr. Vice President, I'm Canadian John McBain. I think everybody in the room recognizes that you and President Bush had some very difficult decisions, and there can be a debate on people in the room agreeing or disagreeing, but I think that each one has a point each way. And I guess the one that's been bothering, I know myself and a lot of people around the world, is can you explain to us exactly how people can be picked up anywhere in the world, be put in Guantanamo Bay, not be told by their families, not get the right to trial, not get the right to trial within a reasonable amount of time, and how you relate that to your comment that compromising values in the name of security is not a good idea. And how you link that to a democratic society who believes in the right to a free trial, etc. And we understand that under military circumstances it is difficult, but now we're a little ways down the road. And can you give some light to people in the room who may be worried that so they could be picked up and their families not told exactly, A, the logic of the Guantanamo Bay story right now, and B, movements your government's making to maybe change that and justify it in terms of what you've been saying?
These are not people sort of picked up at random, because we don't, run up and down the streets of London or Paris or Riyadh saying he's a likely looking prospect, let's put him in Guantanamo. These are people primarily who were picked up on the battlefield in Afghanistan trying to kill our troops. They were in combat. They are treated very humanely. They are not under the provisions of the Geneva Convention. They don't qualify as prisoners of war, but they're treated appropriately in terms of medical care, in terms of food, and the conditions, for example, that exist for them. We have, in fact, released some as we've been able to go through the interrogation process and convince ourselves that for one reason or another they no longer constitute a threat, or they no longer have intelligence that would be valuable to us in prosecuting the war on terror. We also have a number of people there who are, I would describe as deadly enemies, who are very open and very direct about wanting to kill Americans the first chance they get to get back out on the street. Eventually, a number of them, well, some of them already have been turned over to their country, their nationality. Some will be prosecuted and tried. Some, I expect, will be released. But we'll sort through them. The International Red Cross has visited there. We've been very, I think, very careful in terms of how we proceed and how we do treat them. But we are faced with a situation where the war continues, if you will, where people in some cases have come into the United States whose only intent is to murder civilians. And under those circumstances, and given the rules of warfare, we felt we had no choice but to have a place where we could have a repository for these folks as long as they constitute a threat and as long as the conflict continues.
Mr. Vice President, Andrew Gowers, Financial Times, London. You mentioned in your tour of the world North Korea, and while dangers have diminished clearly particularly in Libya and in other places, North Korea seems one place where the threat is at the present undiminished. Could you give us your assessment of the prospects for success in your goal to rid North Korea of nuclear weapons?
Well, clearly the jury's still out with respect to North Korea. We've worked it very hard with in particular with the Chinese, also the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Russians. The Chinese have become, I think, central to that effort. We all agree that it is not in the interest of any of us for the Korean Peninsula to become a repository of nuclear weapons. The effort needs to be made if we're going to be successful resolving this matter peacefully by diplomatic means. The effort needs to be made, as it is being made, to persuade the North Koreans that they have no choice if they want to have normal kinds of commercial relationships with those of us that are involved in the enterprise, but to give up their aspirations to acquire nuclear weapons. We've had 2 meetings in Beijing so far. I would expect there'll be more as we continue to move forward on that basis. The key here was, say, the Chinese and having the other nations engage. Today, can I predict the outcome? I can't. But we think we're approaching it on a sensible basis, that this is the right way to proceed, to try to resolve it diplomatically by making it clear to the North Koreans that they really have no option if they want to have any kind of normal relations with the rest of us, and they need those relations in terms of just feeding their people, maintaining some kind of viable economy in the North. They absolutely have to have the support of Japan, South Korea, China, Russia, and the United States.
Mr. Vice President, Fred Kemp of the Wall Street Journal. You say the jury is still out on North Korea. I wonder if you can talk about the jury on Iran. And specifically, how would you judge the European efforts right now in the negotiations with Iran? One of the most controversial phrases in Europe was that of the axis of evil. Is Iran still a member of that axis?
Well, we're hopeful that the effort by our European friends, the Germans, the French, and the Brits have been most directly involved, working with the Iranians to try to get the Iranians to agree to a more intrusive inspection regime, which they've now done. We'll have to see whether or not that produces the desired result. We believe that the Iranians have been actively and aggressively pursuing an effort to develop nuclear weapons. They deny that, but there seems to be a good deal of evidence out there to indicate that, in fact, that's exactly what they have been doing. It's in everybody's interest, I believe, especially our European friends and allies, to see to it that the Iranians live up to the commitments that they've now made. Truly intrusive inspections, a more robust inspection regime administered by the IAEA, and they keep the commitments they made to the British, German, and French foreign ministers, and we'll do everything we can to support that effort.
One last question.
From the United States. Last night, Minister Shimon Peres proposed a four-point approach to creating peace between Palestine and Israel. The thoughts he shared with us were that the U.S. would guarantee the security of a border that those two nations would agree to. Second, that the EU would offer membership to both Israel and Palestine. Third, that both nations would join the Partnership for Peace. And fourth, that they would commit to fight terrorism. I wonder if you would comment on his proposals.
I haven't had an opportunity to look at them or study them in detail. The prospect of guaranteeing borders strikes me as sort of a traditional concept for traditional conflict, and we haven't really had a traditional conflict there. The problem, of course, has been in large part generated by terrorism, by suicide bombings and so forth. And somehow we've got to find a way, I think, to take down the structures of terror, which is part of the roadmap that was developed by the quartet, if we're going to get to the point where there can be sufficient trust on both sides to enter into negotiations to resolve the outstanding conflicts, to decide where the border goes and establish a permanent peace. Shimon Peres is a man I've known a long time. I've got a lot of respect for him. I'm sure he's doing everything he can think of to try to move forward in a very, very difficult area. But I wouldn't, at this stage, I wouldn't want to sort of put a stamp of approval on his proposal. We deal with the Prime Minister and the government in power in Israel, and they speak for the Israelis, and we're always happy to listen to other ideas and notions, but ultimately, in terms of our interaction with Israel in particular, clearly the government of Mr. Sharon's the one that we pay closest attention to at present.
Vice President, to conclude the two questions. The first one, we spoke yesterday a lot about UN reform. You hinted to it in your own speech. Could you share with us what should be done in order to make the global institutional framework more effective? You used the word effective. What can we do to make it more effective?
I mean, the United Nations in particular?
The United Nations in particular.
I could get in a lot of trouble right here, I'm sure. Well, there has, from time to time, there's been discussion about the need to sort of modernize and update the UN. The arrangements were settled on in San Francisco in 1945, and that was nearly 60 years ago. We've got certain anomalies, I think, in that the structure of the United Nations as it's currently constituted doesn't necessarily fit with the way the world works and is organized today. There are major powers that are not represented or don't have as much influence at the UN as they might have if this were 1945 and we were establishing those arrangements. I don't want to get any more detailed than that. I don't want to recommend specific changes sort of on a national basis. I think those are the kinds of issues that need to be worked out internationally. At some point, I would expect that there'll be proposals made by various members of the United Nations to reform and upgrade, modernize the institution. I don't think I should recommend any here this morning.
Vice President Cheney, I may take a quote in your Christmas card. You quoted Benjamin Franklin, and he said, "And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" Do you consider the United States to be an empire? And every empire has something which is threatening to the people on the street. What can the United States do to be perceived in the world as a non-threatening empire by those who look for freedom, but as a threatening empire for those who threaten our security?
Well, first of all, that quote was selected by my wife. She should have to explain why it was on the Christmas card. Secondly, it refers to an incident that occurred in our Constitutional Convention. And when Franklin was speaking about the importance of some recognition of the importance of the Almighty in the affairs of man. It did not refer, or should not be taken as some kind of indication that the United States today sees itself as an empire. We don't. I think that there are some fundamental differences between the United States today, the way we operate, the things we believe in, the way we've conducted ourselves over the course of our history, that distinguishes, if you will, from what might be identified as an empire. We do believe very deeply in democratic principles and practices. We have had, on occasion in the past, the opportunity to deploy massive military forces and to put them in the heart of Europe, in the heart of Asia, and then having done that, to create democracies where previously there had been dictatorships and empires, and then withdraw to our own shores without any aggrandizement in terms of territory or any of the other trappings of empire, if you will, I guess. And I think from the standpoint of history, we're unique in that regard. So I wouldn't let the Benjamin Franklin quote be misinterpreted as somehow it's intended now to talk about the United States as an empire, where we don't see ourselves in that light. We don't believe we've acted that way. I would argue that there are millions of people in the world today who are free of tyranny and have the opportunity to live in freedom and under democracies because of the past activities of the United States. I would refer to our friend here from Bosnia as one example. And if we were a true empire, we would currently preside over a much greater piece of the Earth's surface than we do. That's not the way we operate.
Mr. Vice President, I want to give you, as a kind of reminder of your visit here in Davos, a mountain crystal, and in some way it's symbolic, I would say. It symbolizes nearly the world. There are many hard edges, it's very different, but let's hope that everywhere freedom and democracy may shine.